On April 3rd, 1968, the Southern preacher stepped into the pulpit of the Church of God in Christ in Memphis, Tennessee, in front of a standing room only crowd. The next day, an assassin's bullet would claim this preacher's life. But on this night, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered one of the most memorable speeches of his entire career. Speaking in support of striking sanitation workers, he declared his willingness to die for the civil rights struggle if necessary. He said, "I don't know what's going to happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. And I don't mind, like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will, and He's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." As I listened to Dr. King's recording, several questions swirled around my mind. What causes an individual to embrace death in defense of an ideal? What gives a person courage to stand up in the face of injustice? And what is the role of someone like Dr. King in American culture? While I didn't know it at the time, this speech was my first encounter with what some have called the prophetic tradition. Today, I'd like to tell you a little bit about how this tradition has shaped my career as a scholar and how it informs my understanding of what it means to be Christian. We often think of the prophets as God's mouthpiece to the people of Israel. But in this estimation of the prophets, we miss the fact that these were an odd bunch of people. These brothers and sisters had issues. They was going through some things. At different times, they were viewed as socially inept, mentally unstable, and physically unfit. But in spite of their struggles, they left a powerful legacy of speaking truth to power that continues to inform practices of social critique today. We misunderstand the role of the prophets. We think of them as divine fortune tellers. I mean, let's just be honest. It was pretty cool when Elijah accurately predicted that rain would not fall for 3 years. But the prophetic tradition is so much more. These men and women were God's representatives to the people of Israel. In the face of immorality, idolatry, and injustice, they spoke with candor, frankness, and conviction against sin. The spiritual, mental, and physical health of society depended on how people responded to the prophetic word. But prophets were outsiders. They weren't viewed as part of the people. People weren't trying to listen to what they had to say. I mean, imagine going to a president and telling him or her that if the nation doesn't repent, everybody's going into slavery. Try this. Try going into your neighborhood and telling your neighbors that if they don't turn back to God, God's going to rain down fire on heaven on them like Jonah did. Now, assuming you are not placed into an institution, let me know how that goes for you. People thought the prophets were crazy. Their messages were met with insults, imprisonment, and even murder. But these men and women went bravely in the face of that, saying, "Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around." When we think of the prophets, we're forced to wrestle with the fact that not just were these people viewed as outsiders, not just were they viewed as crazy, but the prophets faced the reality that people always were against them. People were always against them. As a rhetorical scholar, I study how people craft messages to reach particular audiences. the prophets broke every rule of effective communication. Frankly, you don't even need a PhD in rhetoric to recognize how strange some of their communication was. Conventional wisdom would tell you that it's not a good idea to refer to all the women of the region as cows like Amos did. Any level of thought might suggest that when you try and walk around naked for 3 years to dramatize the sinful condition of a people like Isaiah did, you're not going to do a very good job of winning friends and influencing people. But Isaiah went right on ahead and got his tan on. Any degree of thought might suggest that when you refer to an entire nation as a free prostitute who actually pays her partners like Ezekiel does, it might generate some controversy. We question why the prophets were so harsh. But you see, prophetic rhetoric stands in stark contrast to conventional rhetoric. Conventional rhetoric values diplomacy. The prophets embrace radicalism. Conventional rhetoric seeks to adapt to social norms, but the prophets acted like they didn't have no home training. They lacked civility. The conventional rhetoric seeks to compromise with people to reach an agreement. The prophets view compromise as a betrayal of principle. Conventional rhetoric seeks to uphold the status quo. The prophet views that status quo as the problem. You see, when it comes to the prophet, the extremity, their message is so extreme because they saw the severity of the crisis. People wonder, why are the prophets so angry? It's because they saw a society in peril. When it comes to the prophets, you have to consider the words of people like Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel in his celebrated book on the prophets when he said, "To us, injustice is slight. To the prophet, a disaster. To us, injustice is injurious to the welfare of the people. To the prophet, a death blow to existence. To us, an episode. To the prophet, a catastrophe, a threat to the world." You see, the extremity of their message indicates the severity of the crisis they perceived. To the prophet, society didn't need tweaking. It demanded transformation. So when we think about the prophets, you have to understand that the prophetic word was meant to awaken people out of apathy. The prophet provided an alternative consciousness to the status quo. Heschel went on to say, prophecy is the voice that God has lent to silent agony. A voice to the plundered poor, to the profaned riches of this world. Or as James Darcy so eloquently put it, the prophet's task is to provoke an emotional response to sin, a reaction to the pathos of God. Ultimately, the prophet's success didn't rest in his or her successful or the audience's reception of the message. It depended on his or her faithfulness to the message. If you look at what God told Ezekiel, he said, you're going to speak whether they hear or do not hear, because they're a rebellious house. And it's this tradition of speaking truth to power, even when people aren't listening, that has informed America's practice of social critique. Throughout American history, social reformers have drawn on this tradition to offer potent critiques of America at moments of crisis. Susan B. Anthony drew on this tradition to tell America that it needed to treat its women equal to men. Cesar Chavez invoked this tradition to call on the nation to provide equitable pay and fair work conditions for farm workers. Journalist Ida B. Wells Barnett drew on this when she courageously chronicled the devastating legacy of lynching in American history at a time when few African Americans were willing to talk about the racist practice. Now, you shouldn't think that every person who draws on the prophetic tradition is necessarily espousing Judeo-Christian beliefs. But the key here is that this tradition floats beneath the surface of many practices of social critique, even when they're secular. Dr. Cornel West identifies 3 defining characteristics of contemporary prophetic rhetoric. First, Prophetic rhetoric involves critical or Socratic questioning. What does that mean? Let me offer you an example. When ex-slave Frederick Douglass was asked to speak for the 4th of July in 1852 to celebrate the nation's independence, he stepped boldly to the lectern and he said, "What to the slave is the 4th of July?" In that simple question, he highlighted the inconsistency between America's embrace of freedom and the institution of slavery. Many musicians often regularly raise critical questions. My favorite R&B singer, Marvin Gaye, gave voice to the pain of urban communities during a period of deindustrialization and division over the Vietnam War when he asked, "What's going on?" Rapper Tupac Shakur questioned America's priorities when he reflected on the fact that America has money for war, but it can't feed the poor. Critical or Socratic questionings seek to highlight inconsistencies between our practices and our stated values. The second aspect of this condition is that the prophet maintains a consistent witness to injustice. That is, the prophet embraces the burden or responsibility of always speaking out against injustice wherever it exists. Similar to the prophets of the Old Testament, the prophet was not only concerned with one group of people or one issue, but the prophet was concerned wherever injustice exists. The prophet was that individual who could not stay silent in the face of state-sponsored genocide against our Native American brothers and sisters. The prophet was that person who would never get used to the idea of children working in sweatshops at the turn of the 20th century. Even today, the prophet is that person who speaks out on behalf of the women and men around the world who face the daily horrors of the sexual trafficking industry. The prophet is that person who cannot stay silent because, in the words of a group of pastors in the 1960s, a time comes when silence is betrayal. We often are not grateful for prophets until they're gone. We celebrate King today. Got a statue of him in the mall on Washington and so forth, and he's our national hero. But sometimes our memory of our heroes blinds us to the fact that during their lifetime, we really rejected them. If we carefully consider King's career, we have to acknowledge the fact that from right after the Montgomery bus boycotts until the time of his death, the FBI kept him under constant surveillance as a threat to the state. And even the FBI at a couple of occasions encouraged him to kill himself. It wasn't just the FBI who was King's enemy. If you look at polling data from his public career, you'll find that the majority of Americans viewed him more as a troublemaker than as a national hero. You see, prophets disrupt and threaten our way of life, so we reject them. We label them with terms like unpatriotic, hateful, and enemies of the state. Nothing could be further from the truth. The prophet is motivated by a deep love for the people, for the least of these. This love prevents him from staying silent in the face of injustice, which afflicts those people that he loves. James Baldwin memorably described this very sentiment when he said, "I love America more than any other country on earth, which is why I reserve the right to criticize her perpetually." Third, prophetic rhetoric operates from a blues sensibility. The prophet has the unique ability to stare into the face of darkness without falling prey to darkness. We often like to avoid dark realities. We don't like to make eye contact with that homeless brother on the street because we don't want to feel guilty about not supporting him in his suffering. We also rationalize our avoidance of that homeless brother by saying he would only misuse whatever support we might offer anyway. Our response to suffering betrays the reality that if we were in the story of the Good Samaritan, we'd be more likely to be like the Levite or the priest than the Samaritan. Furthermore, our response to suffering blinds us to the realities, to the larger social questions about what conditions are creating homelessness in the first place. We structure our lives in a way that causes us to avoid social pain, because it's easier to avoid suffering than to face the heartbreaking reality that even as I speak, people around the nation and the world experience injustice, exploitation, and oppression. Whether it's gang violence in Chicago, water in Flint, Michigan, or crystal meth in Appalachia, the prophet does not run from the darkness. She pierces through it with the light of the truth. She courageously musters up the ability to confront tragedy without losing hope. In her classic book, Their Eyes Were Watching God, Zora Neale Hurston captures this notion of a blues sensibility. At a moment when she's describing her characters at a time of pain, disaster, and even death, she writes this about them. They looked as though they were staring into the dark, but their eyes were watching God. It is this power of perspective that lies at the heart of a blues sensibility. Zechariah aptly describes the prophet as a prisoner of hope. The prophet understands with Solomon that sorrow is better than laughter because sadness has a refining influence on us. You see, the prophet resides in the darkness, but the darkness doesn't reside in her. For me, this tradition is personal. Besides exposing me to a fascinating tradition of social critique, the prophetic tradition informs my understanding of what it means to be a Christian. The prophet serves as a moral compass, guiding people back to God. In the face of moral compromise and hypocrisy, the prophet challenged society to be true to its core values. As sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois said, the prophets say ugly things to an ugly world. They cry aloud and spare not. They shout from the housetops, and they make this world so damned uncomfortable with its nasty burden of evil that it tries to get good and does get better. We need prophets. Every day we wake up in a world in which 100 million children are homeless. 40 million people live in slavery. And 1/2 of the world's population lives on less than $2.50 a day. Prophets force us to face the institutional and systemic realities that foster these realities, that foster these forms of oppression. They bring us face to face with the role of things like racism, sexism, materialism, and colonialism in reinforcing cycles of oppression. Truly, we live in some dark times. Hearing prophetic voices is difficult because when you listen to a prophet, she or he will make you question the assumptions that you live your life by. Adopting a prophetic stance is even more challenging because you have the challenge of saying what no one wants to hear, but everyone needs to know. This is why false prophets were so popular in ancient Israel. They told the people things that made them feel good about themselves. They made the people happy. But when God's people adopt prophetic stances, we don't make people feel good about themselves, but we give society a small glimpse into the heart of God. We reveal a God who hates oppression, who is concerned for the widow and the orphan, who cares for the refugee and the immigrant, and who views all people as equal regardless of their ethnicity or gender because he made them in his image. We reveal a God who desires for justice to roll down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. This divine revelation lies at the heart of the prophetic tradition of speaking truth to power. 2 weeks before Dr. King's death, his dear friend, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, paid him this compliment. Where in America do we see a voice like the prophets of Israel? Martin Luther King Jr. is a voice, a vision, and a way. The whole future of America depends on the impact and influence of Dr. King. Now let's be clear on what Heschel's saying here. Heschel is not saying that Dr. King was perfect. He's not saying that his public or private lives were free of fault. But what Heschel is saying is that the vibrancy of America's experiment with democracy was inextricably bound together with the nation's response to social prophets like King, who told America ugly things about itself. You see, prophets attempt to reconnect us with values that have been lost, forgotten, or ignored. If you want to test the moral health of any society, see what the people do with the prophet.